Good afternoon, everyone. This is Nora Valenzuela. I'm the chair of the World Affairs Council. Our moderator will be Dr. Haggard today, but unfortunately, Nassim is not able to connect with us via audio, so we're still waiting for her. While we're waiting for her to come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Haggard to kick off the program and introduce our speaker, Dr. Pak, today, and we will proceed until the technical challenges are resolved. Dr. Haggard, please go ahead, sir. Welcome.
No, thanks. I'm happy to have the opportunity to chair this session. I just want to make sure that Jung is with us. Jung, are you with us?
I'm here, Steph. Can you see me?
Yeah, there you are. Great, great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for joining us. My name is Stefan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program at the University of California, San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to chair this session today. The group of us in the country who watch North Korea seriously is relatively small, but Jung Pak enjoys a position of particular prestige and respect within that community. She has held a number of positions in the intelligence community in the United States, both at the CIA and at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She's done literally hundreds of intelligence assessments dealing with North Korea over the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years before she shifted to Brookings in 2017. She now holds a Korea chair at Brookings, which, as you know, is one of the most prominent think tanks in Washington. And we're gathered here in particular because of this terrific book that she's written called Becoming Kim Jong Un, which has just appeared. And we're going to be talking about that book today and also taking your questions. First, just a few standard protocols for being on one of these. If you're not muted and you're in the audience, if you could do us the favor of muting, because background noise does make a difference. And also, if you have a question that you'd like to ask in the course of the meeting, if you could put it on the chat function, I'll try to moderate the chat and keep track of questions. So with that, Jung, again, thanks very much for being here. When we were talking earlier, you said that you wanted to say something about the cover art of the book. And I have to say, this is a really striking picture again. Do you want to lead off by telling us how you chose this image?
Yeah, well, thanks to the World Affairs Council of Orange County, Nora and Nassim for inviting me. And for Steph, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so happy to be speaking with so many of you today, and I'm really grateful for your interest in this book. I asked Steph to allow me some time to talk about the cover art of the book because I'm so in love with this art. You probably don't know this, but I was an aspiring art historian, you know, when I was in college, and that was the path not taken for the path not taken. But you know, when I saw this cover from the good folks at Ballantine Books, I thought this is exactly my editor and the team really understand what I wanted to do with this book. And what I like about the cover art, Steph, if I could trouble you to do some Price is Right hostessing over here.
Sure, absolutely.
And showing the cover. And it's that, you know, in so many instances where we see when the media talks about North Korea, that it's a very flattened, two-dimensional image of North Korea, or it's a very comical image of North Korea or the North Korean leader. For example, in 2016, the New Yorker had a cover on their pages where Kim Jong Un, after conducting a second nuclear test, is presented as a really chubby baby wearing a onesie and playing with his nukes and missiles, which are his toys. But what I like about this this cover is that when you look at it, and I can see that people can still see that the slide, is that he's not presented as a two-dimensional person, but a whole. There's a three-dimensionality to it, where and you know, in typical biographies or autobiographies, you see the person's face full frontal, but here it's very shaded. It's gradations of light and dark. You see him coming at you. and the perspective is from an overview camera. Maybe it's the CIA looking at him, but I think this was taken from the Singapore summit. We're looking at him from above. We don't know where his gaze is, and he's stepping into his own shadow and away from his past in many ways, but also stepping into his own shadow of who knows what the future might bring. So I really like how this cover art really encapsulates all that we know and we don't know about Kim Jong Un and where North Korea is headed. And I think this, and this is what I wanted to do with the book, is to present this very holistic view of North Korea, separate from some of the tidbits and snapshots that we get from newspaper articles. And as we know, there's been a lot of attention focused on North Korea over the years and the decades. And Steph knows this very intimately as well, having covered this region for so long. So, I wanted to present that as Kim Jong Un, not as a caricature, not as a two-dimensional, baby and not a madman bent on destroying the United States, but somebody who has a past, a future, who has preferences and priorities and a personality.
Jung, that's great. That's a really great start. And in fact, one of the things I liked about this book is you continually refer to the fact that anyone who's in the intelligence community who wants to understand an adversary really has to pare away their own biases and look at the circumstances, not as we would like them to be, but as they actually are. This is an incredibly rich book, but let me start with a question about biography, because one of the things you go through is Kim Jong Un's unusual upbringing. And I'll just focus on two parts of that because they come through very strongly. One is the fact that he's a son, obviously, of an incredible dictator in his own right, and therefore lives in this pampered cocoon-like environment. But then on the other hand, there's this interesting feature of his youth, which is he was schooled in part in Switzerland and therefore was exposed there to kids from elsewhere in the world, as well as an advanced industrial capitalist democracy. What do you make of those two conflicting features of his upbringing?
I think, Steph, what you bring up is the paradox of North Korea, and this is what Victor Cha, another a colleague who's over in Washington as well, is talks about. It's the paradox of North Korea. And I think Kim also embodies that paradox, in that he and I think what happens is that because of his pampered upbringing, he's cocooned in this cocoon surrounded by small armies of sycophants, of servants, of chauffeurs, and designated friends. That he comes into the leadership of North Korea as somebody who is thrust forward by that history, but also by that by the weight of what he inherits. But I also think that brings him to. That makes him more confident and more aggressive in many ways because of that, because of being surrounded by people who tell him that that seeks to show him that what he says is the right way to go. It's a culture of repression that he's inherited that also pushes him toward this kind of more optimistic vision of North Korea. But on the other hand, you have this sense of when he's in, having grown up in, or having had some education in Switzerland, and I'll remind the audience that he only spent about 4 years studying in Switzerland. I remember this one photograph of Kim, with his classmates. All of the other children are leaning over each other, holding onto each other, smiling widely. Meanwhile, Kim Jong Un is standing in the back, his arms straight down his side, and wondering what's going on. So you get the sense of this this isolated, somewhat removed child in Switzerland, but then when he's unable to be able to tell people that my father Kim Jong Il has nuclear weapons, and I am the son of the supreme leader of North Korea. So. But I think what's so interesting about his time in Switzerland is that this was at the height of the famine, right, Steph? And Steph, you've written widely about, the effects of the famine and But Kim Jong Un never saw that. He never saw the effects of the famine. He was, so he was enjoying playing video games in Switzerland, going to Disneyland, going, swimming in the French Riviera and skiing in the Alps. So he doesn't see any of that. So while in Switzerland, outside of North Korea, he is a very small fish in a very big pond. In North Korea, he is the biggest fish in the smallest pond.
Absolutely.
But, I think what you can't take away is the fact that he's still this millennial dictator who has grown up and has only known privileges, and that I think affects his foreign policy decision making.
Yeah, you've raised a question implicitly that we struggle with, those who watch North Korea, which is what kind of regime is this? Because it has a formal structure that looks like a communist party system. It looks very much like the Chinese or the Vietnamese communist party system. The military is very heavily represented. You could argue, you could make a case for the fact that this is almost like a military regime. But then on the other hand, it's a monarchy, because you've had these two successions, which are basically from father to son, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il in 1994, and then in December 2011 with the death of Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong Un. What do you think, how do you think that influences North Korea's outlook? I mean, the fact that this is really the last remaining monarchy probably on the planet. I mean, outside of the Middle East monarchies, perhaps.
Yeah, what's so interesting about North Korea, I think you're absolutely right. They've taken bits and pieces of things that were useful to them. So in addition to being the only succession in the communist world, right? That's unique in this for North Korea. But it's the regime has also taken bits from Confucianism, from Japanese colonialism, from Christianity. There are Christian missionaries in the 19th century in Korea. They've taken aspects of Stalinism, and as well as a variety of other systems that make sense to them. So I think it's this. They've taken what was useful, to shore up the regime and to reinforce that single family line to legitimize and justify its control. And I think that that goes to the heart of why they're pursuing nuclear weapons, and why they have nuclear weapons, and it's probably unlikely to give them up, is that the nuclear weapons and this vision of a hostile outside world that they can only trust themselves. That is all driven by the regime's, the Kim family's desire to remain at the control and to have that sole control over the fate of North Korea. That I think that really points to how difficult it is, and the question that that the U.S. keeps continuing to work on is, how do you convince Kim Jong Un, convince the regime that the threats, the provocative actions, the nuclear weapons make his survival less secure than more secure, and I think that is the crux of the problem here.
Yeah, that really raises this question, which is exactly where I wanted to go, which is this question of the kind of paradox of Kim's power. I mean, do you think it's possible for him to become a reformer? If we look at the Chinese system, it was really the death of Mao that allowed Deng Xiaoping to take the country in a new direction. On the other hand, he's got ultimate autocratic power. If he chose to give up his nuclear weapons, if he chose to move in another direction, he certainly would appear to have the capability to do so. Though there's this very interesting moment in the Bolton memoir in Hanoi where Kim Jong Un says something like, I can't give you any more. I can't make any more concessions. I don't know if you noticed that, but what do you think of this kind of paradox? As he seems extraordinarily powerful, yet at the same time, it's not clear whether he's capable of moving in a different direction.
Yeah, I would flip that a little bit. I read the Bolton memoir, and where, and I think this is something that this echoes what his father used to say to U.S. negotiators too, is that the military or the hardliners, pointing to the military or the hardliners as the reason why they can't give more. as the reason why they have to tread very carefully.
Good cop, bad cop. Yeah.
But I also think, but I think that that is a way of just deflecting attention away from himself. I think what's clear, at least with Kim Jong Un, is that he has for the past, since December of 2011, when he came to power, he has made every effort to make the nuclear weapons a part of his brand. He's the only one who controls the nuclear weapons program. He's the one seen with the peanut, right? The what's supposed to be the nuclear warhead. There he is smoking a cigarette at a ballistic missile test. There he is, with his hair flowing in the background as he's observing a successful submarine launched ballistic missile test, right? So he's there, looking at the binoculars, talking to the technicians. He is the nuclear weapons program. And remember in 2017 when Kim and President Trump were engaged in this war of words, and they were talking about whose nuclear button was bigger. Kim said the nuclear button is on my desk in my office, not with the military, not with the party. He was very clear that the nuclear button is under his control. So I don't put too much stock in what Kim or his father has said about hardliners, about not being able to make further concessions. But on the other hand, but I also see him trapped by his own history, being trapped by what he's inherited. And when I look at what he's done with the symmetry and his inability to modulate or calibrate his stance, it's all or nothing, is that he's trapped by the 2-page playbook that he has inherited, that as a result of the fear and repression that he's instilled in his advisors, if he has strong advisors, they're not the ones who are going to be raising their hands to say, well, maybe we should compromise a little bit. Maybe we should, this is not a leadership that encourages creative thinking, that encourages that kind of discussion among equals about what's the best way forward for North Korea. So when I look at North Korea, when I look at Kim and his inability to move the ball forward on denuclearization or on integrating North Korea into the outside with the international community, I see somebody who's trapped and cornered by his history and what he's inherited.
Yeah, I think this is really insightful because you chastise the American intelligence community for wishful thinking, but you also point out how a system like that surrounding Kim Jong Un, sycophants basically, doesn't necessarily generate the best policy for the country. We have a lot of questions coming in on the nuclear issue, and I want to get to that, but I want to try to communicate the scope of this book. And one of the things I like about it is you talk a fair amount about developments in North Korea itself. And there's a great chapter on Ri Sol-ju, Kim Jong-un's wife, but it's not just about her. It's really about this whole development within North Korea of marketization, of reform from below, of the penetration of outside ideas. We think of this as a very closed country, and you and others have pointed out that's not really that way. But the key question is, does all of that strengthen the prospects for reform, or does it actually strengthen the hand of Kim Jong-un that he's able to provide the elites of Pyongyang with these kinds of goods?
What I think is what's been so smart about what Kim has been doing is that he's not denying the changes that are happening in his country. Steph, you and others and your colleagues have talked a great deal and have done really excellent scholarship in examining the changes that have happened since the famine of the 90s, the marketization that has happened, and some of the economic activities that are taking place in North Korea, oftentimes despite the wishes of the regime. So Kim is not denying these changes. In fact, he's embraced them and trying to channel them into alternative ways toward a path that is beneficial to the regime. So for example, his wife, to me, the fact that he even has his wife so publicly out in the open and that she plays such a prominent role is different, because his father and his grandfather didn't like to bring up their personal lives. They generally kept their wives hidden. And it was after, it was later on that, the cult of the mothers would come into being, but not in the way that the image making that Kim Jong Un is doing with his own wife. So when she is seen, she's this very attractive, young, vibrant woman, dressed not in the drab communist socialist, clothing of the olden years, but she's wearing pink, she's wearing blue, she's wearing these beautiful fashions, and she's wearing these, she's at the cosmetic store, she's, looking at the luxury department stores, and really embodying this new culture that the regime is trying to encourage, but trying to channel those consumerist energies toward a domestic idol. So, don't go to China, don't copy South Korean fashion, don't copy Chanel, just look at this, look at your own queen of Pyongyang. And so what I see Kim Jong Un doing, is to try to direct those energies, direct those market fervors, that consumerism toward a domestic model. I think what she also does is that as a young woman attached to a young leader, it's the vision of not their dictatorship of the past, but a dictatorship that is looking forward. They're young. They have as many as 3 children. They're pushing the North Koreans toward a brighter future, a more vibrant, vigorous, optimistic future. So I think she encapsulates all of that, and this is a very deliberate regime move to craft that narrative.
Well, I hadn't thought that this would link directly to the question of the sister, but since we're talking about Ri Sol-ju, we should probably say something about Kim Yo-jong. She's clearly emerged as someone who has a voice with respect to major policy issues in the North, particularly with respect to the South, interestingly. But then several weeks ago, as you know, she issued this very interesting kind of rambling statement about what she thought the prospects were for U.S. North Korea relations. And of course, interest in her rose partly because Kim Jong Un was absent from the scene in 3 separate episodes for about 2 weeks each. And there was this question about secession. What do you make of Kim Yo-jong and her role?
So there are 2 women in North Korea that have some prominence, which is very different. So it's the Kim Yo-jong, the sister, and then the wife Ri Sol-ju that we talked about. So if Ri Sol-ju, the wife, is pure effervescence and beauty and lightness, Kim Yo-jong is all business. She's not wearing colors. She doesn't wear much makeup, while Ri Sol-ju wears makeup. She's always got a clipboard or, trailing her brother in some way. She's the one handing him the pen to sign the agreement at Singapore. She's there in Hanoi. She's holding her brother's ashtray, and she's always wearing a very drab, suit, skirt. So Kim Yo-jong has been all business. So, when her brother was absent, she started making her own statements in her own name back in March. And her latest statement was in July, just a few weeks ago. And what's interesting about her is that she's been brushed aside as not credible potential successor because she is a woman. But I think rather than gender trumping or her gender not allowing her to rise in the ranks, I think that if anything, it's her bloodline that would elevate her. And I think it's clear that her brother has been trying to do that. She's had probably more, she has had as much government experience as her brother. She seems to have been there throughout her brother's succession and through his leadership of North Korea. She's had, leadership positions at least since 2014. And the fact that she appears with him so publicly as suggests that she is his de facto chief of staff. And so, I think what I think Kim Jong Un might be doing with his sister is that he's trying to burnish her military and foreign policy credentials. Previously to the summits, she's kind of been in the background supporting her brother. But whether it's related to Kim Jong Un's potentially poor health or his disappearance back in April, that he might be trying to make sure that his sister has some of that credibility, that military credibility, that security services credibility that would be required in a regime like North Korea if something ever happened to them. So I would say that Kim Jong Un's children are just still too young to take over. So Kim might be thinking in the long term of how to elevate his sister to ease the process in for the next generation of North Korea's leadership.
Well, Jung, we've already generated one idea for an article that either you or I or both of us can write, which is Ri-Sol Ju and Kim Yo-jung as the two faces of North Korea. Let's pivot to the nuclear question, because obviously a lot of the questions we have deal with this. And I want to go back to the fall of 2017. And I guess the broader question is this, it seems like we came closer to conflict in September 2017 than we had in a long time. I mean, it was as bad as early 2013 or even going back farther. But then there's this question of whether you think the Korean Peninsula is actually stable. Because in some ways, the comments that President Trump made at the UN General Assembly, though they were quite shocking, were really just restating US commitment to the deterrent. Is the Korean Peninsula stable, or should we really be worried about it?
I think what's so interesting to me is that back in 2017, when there was polling about among Americans about how big a threat is North Korea, and an overwhelming majority said that North Korea was a critical a threat to U.S. national security. And I think a recent poll that came out of just a couple of months ago, as we have this uneasy stability on the Korean Peninsula right now, is that fewer than half, or about half, of Americans polled thought that North Korea is a critical threat. And I think that points to how much of North Korea's actions can create and shape our perceptions of itself as a threat. So Kim has done what he can over the past 3 years to try to present himself as a responsible leader of a nuclear weapon, of a country that has nuclear weapons. And which is something that the regime has said in its own statements, that we're responsible nuclear weapons power. We're only going to use it to defend ourselves. Also, although I think the nuclear weapons use, that's still how North Korea sees that it's still up in the air and still unclear. So is the Korean Peninsula stable? I don't know, but I don't think that it is, but we have this very right now we have this very false sense of security and stability on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea can become a flashpoint in conflict, potentially leading to a military conflict as a result of what North Korea, what kind of capabilities North Korea possesses. I highlight in the book that it wasn't just the ballistic missile program or the nuclear weapons program that Kim Jong Un has been advancing and accelerating over the years. So the ballistic weapons program, ballistic missiles are now more reliable, more diverse, and more mobile. And so that is really troubling. But he's also been focused on conventional capabilities, selectively boosting its capabilities using drones, for example, suggesting that North Korea continues to incorporate new technologies into its warfare or into its military programs, investing in 180,000 teams of special operations forces. But when Kim does these missile tests or artillery firings, he's not just trying to show the capabilities of the weapons themselves, but he's training the people who are supposed to be operating those systems. So I think that is really problematic. I think that given Kim's promise to develop and show us a new strategic weapon is really troubling. Remember the Christmas gift that he promised back in December, which many people thought would be another long-range ballistic missile test. But I think what I argue in the book is that Kim does not seek peace, but that he seeks, but his regime and his legitimacy requires disruption. And that disruption is in the form of making very credible threats, but also making lethal or non-lethal attacks against South Korea or potentially to Japan. I think we should take that threat seriously. I don't want us to be lulled into this sense that North Korea is no longer a threat. And of course, this is the line that the Trump administration has been taking. So I think we have to stay focused on North Korea and its capabilities and its intentions. And I think that's, contributes to, to this endless fascination with North Korea, and to see what kind of policies we need to undertake to try to really have peace and prosperity in the region.
Well, again, this is a perfect segue, Jung, because it takes us from those tense times around September 2017 to President Moon Jae-in's Winter Olympic gambit, which those of you who haven't followed this closely was really, in my view, quite central to opening up the whole summit era, which included two major summits, North and South, but then, of course, Singapore and Hanoi in 2018 and 19. Let me ask you a retrospective question, and then I'll tell you my view of this. Were you supportive of President Trump's decision to meet directly with Kim Jong Un at the time, not looking backward, but at the time? And then how has your perception of that decision changed or not changed since?
Steph, to be honest, I was horrified that there was a unilateral presidential decision to meet with Kim, and that was, but it was, but given, you can take the girl out of CIA, where I worked for almost, for 9 years, but you can't take the CIA out of the girl. And I think that, after when the decision was made that this summit was going to happen, my analysis and thinking went into how do we make good? How do we, how can we, grab opportunities where we can, and to try to support the administration and policymakers on how to craft this approach to North Korea, given that there was going to be a summit. But I think, one of the things that that was a mantra in the U.S. government was that you don't want to reward Kim or reward the North Korean dictator with something that they wanted for a really long time. That his father wanted it, his grandfather wanted it, and Kim Jong Un almost certainly wanted it. And the reason that that many experts looked at this meeting as premature and ill-advised was that showing up on the world stage with the U.S. president, the most powerful person, most powerful leader in the world, as a nuclear, as a country that has nuclear weapons, is that it legitimizes Kim as being right about what North Korea was doing, of justifying and really reaching his fruition by standing firm against not giving up nuclear weapons, lobbing threats against the United States and to South Korea and to Japan. And so that was worrisome. I think, if anything, that the domestically speaking, the fact that Kim Jong Un was so able to so easily meet with President Trump and have this relationship and have this whole slew of summits was that it probably had the effect of silencing any voice that might have suggested to Kim that we're going to have to make some sort of concessions before we can get that goal, and that it reinforces Kim's own sense of being right about what he's doing. And so I think that's probably one of the lasting damages of the summit. I would hope that it seems that what North Korea has continued to refrain from nuclear and long-range ballistic missile testing. Although as we rang in the new year in 2020, he said, "I'm not bound by that moratorium anymore." So, so I think that we're still trying to make good of, we have to move forward in this, but I think what has happened is that the extreme bilateralism of the Kim-Trump relationship has marginalized the other countries and other stakeholders, which is really to North Korea's advantage.
Yeah, I really want to pick up on that theme and talk a little bit about the relationship with our allies, South Korea, and also with China. But to make the discussion interesting, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. The Obama administration's strategic patience policy was basically going nowhere. You had these very high tensions in the fall of 2017. It's a regime where you're probably not going to make any progress unless you engage Kim Jong Un directly. Is there some way that this process could have been structured with a summit that might have gotten us farther than we ultimately got?
Yeah, I think, at the tactical level, Steph, what I was hoping would not happen when the summit was called is that the president wouldn't set a date. The president set a date prematurely, I thought.
I agree.
Moving past that there was going to be a summit, the president didn't have to set a firm date, because that would have given the U.S. negotiators some sort of leverage in negotiating with their North Korean counterparts to negotiate a better statement than what came out of the Singapore summit, which was pretty watered down, very tepid. It did not move the needle forward, move the needle on denuclearization. But I think what the implementation was, I think, was very dysfunctional and shoddy. I think we could have, the president could have been firmer in saying, well, in getting Kim to commit to some real working level negotiations. But given the president's statements about, I don't want to talk about maximum pressure anymore. Kim is not responsible for his human rights violations. The shorter range ballistic missile tests don't bother me. And so I think that sends the wrong message to Kim, that as long as he refrains from nuclear and ballistic missile testing, that he has a whole range of other things that he could do to improve his capabilities.
Right, and Jung, you're making a very important point that I don't think is adequately appreciated, which is that summits usually follow extensive lower level negotiations in which most of the details are worked out, and that the leaders are really operating at a margin. But in this case, there just wasn't the kind of preparation or agreement on moving towards a timetable or a declaration of what the North Koreans had on the nuclear front. And that's partly what set up the Hanoi failure to me as well, is there just wasn't enough done in advance. But let me turn to something you just raised that I think is extremely important. And we can talk about all three of them, but I certainly want to talk about South Korea and China. Obviously, relations between the Moon Jae-in administration and the Trump administration now are not good because of the negotiations over the burden sharing agreement. And one of the conclusions of your book, which I agree with just completely, in fact, I think you listed as your first priority is go back to the alliances and make sure that they're firm. Can you talk about where the U.S. South Korea relationship is? Because that's really an important part of the story.
Yeah, I think the U.S. South Korea alliance has been fraying at the edges and for the past several years. I think it has, of course, it has a lot to do with South Korea's domestic priorities and its own national security priorities. But what we've seen is, I don't think it's a secret that that President Trump is not a big fan of alliances, and that he said very openly, why do we have troops in South Korea? Why do we have troops in Asia? Why don't our allies pay us more for our troops? And those are good questions, but should be private conversations about what is the right amount? How do you right size the number of U.S. troops, or how do you right size the relationship? President Trump has been very open about how he feels about South Korea and about that alliance there. By all accounts, I think the demand of a 400% increase in South Korean contributions to the alliance has been, or the support of U.S. troops has been considered to be very extreme. And so I think there's that part, but it's also that President Moon wants to create a bigger space for himself, and progressive administrations in South Korea generally tend to be much more engagement oriented and concessions and driven by concessions to North Korea versus pressure. And so President Moon has his own personal, national, and priorities with respect to North Korea, and I think that contributes to a big split, or exacerbates the split, as given that what we see is that the U.S. going one way, South Korea going another way, but not always necessarily meeting and converging on those priorities. So I think we're gonna, repairing the alliances has to be a key part, has to be the center of gravity when it comes to dealing with North Korea.
Yeah, and let me just let's talk a little bit about a little bit more about South Korea's Moon Jae-in, because President Trump, but also Prime Minister Abe, are quite skeptical of this pro-engagement approach. And of course, Moon Jae-in is somewhat circumscribed in what he can do by the fact that he's, in fact, in my view, been fairly loyal to the United States. I mean, he's not run out ahead of the United States very far. He's not giving away the store. He might be talking about engagement, but he hasn't actually had room to do much. Do you think the United States should be granting Moon Jae-in more room for maneuver with respect to North Korea?
Steph, I think that's right. I think President Moon has been fairly balanced, but he's also constrained by sanctions, right? I mean, he doesn't want to be violating sanctions, and he doesn't want to veer too far away from the alliance with the United States. So I think that's one of the glues that's keeping the alliance together and that relationship pretty intact so far. But I think it points to how the U.S. can be responsive to South Korea's desires and South Korea's priorities, and how do we talk about this in a frank way that advances both South Korea's priorities and our priorities, with respect to North Korea or to the region. But I think it would be a mistake to dismiss South Korea's national priorities, South Korea's priorities, or to ignore South Korea's preferences. But that's what alliances do. You're supposed to be consulting with each other and advising each other on the best way forward. So I totally agree with you that President Moon has been sticking to the U.S. and not moving away from sanctions by any means.
Well, let's talk about the gorilla in the room, because in some ways China has really exercises an extraordinarily complex and important influence over this whole process. If you remember back at the Mar-a-Lago summit, Presidents Xi and Trump actually had agreed on imposing multilateral sanctions on North Korea in a new way. We were in a cooperative phase. Subsequently, that relationship has clearly frayed. How do you see the China card in all of this?
Beijing has very little appetite at this point to be helping the U.S. on any shared problem. I think Beijing's priorities have been no chaos, no war, no nukes, and it prioritizes stability in North Korea versus pressure. And Chinese leaders have long preferred carrots versus sticks in terms of dealing with North Korea. So I think what the U.S., this deepening of the U.S.-China competition or confrontation, whatever you want to call it, has probably been damaging to any kind of cooperation on North Korea. And I think Beijing since 2019 or late 2018 has been advocating for the lifting of sanctions on North Korea, given the fact, pointing to the fact that North Korea has not done a nuclear or long-range ballistic missile test. So that's not helpful, it gives North Korea the space to maneuver. When I look back at the 2 years of summitry, Beijing has bracketed every single inter-Korean meeting and U.S. North Korea meeting with a meeting of their own, suggesting that Beijing does not want to be marginalized. It wants to coach North Korea. It wants to make sure that North Korea does, says and does the right thing, that are consistent with China's preferences, and to get a readout afterwards, and to make sure that to at least create the perception that North Korea and China are very much lashed up on this. So what I see North Korea doing similarly is that it's trying to mend fences with Beijing, to diffuse the sanctions pressure, to ensure that Beijing will continue to provide North Korea with assistance, and political and economic assistance. The problem with that, from my view, is that after Xi Jinping went to Pyongyang in 2019, which was the first time that the Chinese head of state has visited North Korea. What that reinforces is that regardless of all the terrible things that North Korea has done, Beijing will not abandon North Korea. That might embolden Kim more, thinking that his leash is much longer than it is, and that it creates the perception from Kim's part that whatever he does, he can always float the idea of engagement, and Beijing will come running and support it regardless of what it has done.
Yeah, well, we've had several questions on sanctions and whether they work. And what you bring out, I think, is a very important point, is they could work, but it's very difficult to sustain them as long as China sees it in its interest to maintain North Korea afloat. Let's turn to the future a little bit, and I'll start with the short run and then talk about what might happen under a second Trump or Biden administration. But let's start with the idea of an October surprise. At Hanoi, Kim Jong Un brought an offer to the table, which he at least considered was a relatively serious offer, which is to partially close down the Yongbyon nuclear research facility. It wasn't exactly clear what was on offer, but then in return, the United States would lift, I think, some of the most significant multilateral sanctions against North Korea. Do you think there's any possibility of an October surprise where President Trump would turn to North Korea for a foreign policy win in advance of the election?
I think the October surprise, the idea of another summit before the election is highly unlikely, given what North Korea has been saying about not wanting to meet under these circumstances, that unless the U.S. changes its approach, unless the U.S. reduces its pressure on North Korea, that it doesn't see a point in meeting with the U.S. president again. The last time the U.S. and the North Koreans had any kind of meeting was back in the fall, in October, where they met for 8 hours. And basically nothing happened at that point on that day either. And so I don't think it's very likely, given, and I'll speak from the North Korean perspective, Kim's perspective. I think Hanoi was pretty devastating for Kim. He went out on a limb, traveling 70 hours by train to Hanoi, if you remember. I'm sure that was a very unpleasant trip back to Pyongyang. When you look at some of the reporting and some of the accounts of that meeting, that Kim thought that President Trump was willing to give something, was that he was much more optimistic about what President Trump was going to offer on the table, when that was just not the case. And I think there were cases. It was a case where both sides seemed to have this very an optimistic view of what could potentially happen, and the fact that Kim took this risk for him, from his perspective, I think, in that he failed so spectacularly, was pretty devastating. Look at how many people he's purged. His sister had to go a little bit under the radar after Hanoi. The main negotiator was purged. Another senior official disappeared for a while. So it was clear that Kim Jong Un was not happy about Hanoi. And so for him to agree to another meeting with President Trump, he would have to be extremely confident that President Trump had something to offer. Not only that he had something to offer, but that President Trump could actually follow through and implement it beyond October, beyond November. And I don't think that's the case. And I think another motivator, if Kim were to decide, is that if he thought that his economy was under extremely dire circumstances, and I don't think that's the case either. He seems to be, North Korea is the king of muddling through in its economy, and I think the fact that the people are so entrepreneurial and that its officials are so adept at generating currency for the regime and for themselves really helps the regime stay afloat. So I don't think any of those motivators or drivers are strong enough or even present for Kim to even agree, to entertain an October surprise or an October summit with President Trump.
Well, the one thing you just said, I think I just strongly agree with and want to underline, which is predictions of the demise of this regime have typically been premature, and their ability to survive is quite substantial. If you can live through a famine that kills 600,000 to 1 million people, you can certainly weather a COVID shutdown. I think that's absolutely right. Let me pose 2 more questions. And again, I really appreciate our audience sending in questions. I'm doing my best to kind of integrate them into the flow of our conversation. And there are many of them, unfortunately, which we can't turn to. But let me ask about a possible Biden administration. I can imagine under a second Trump administration that the president would continue to pursue this diplomacy and perhaps exploit the advantages of the current moratorium as long as it lasts, and claim at least a partial win in that regard. But what about, or what are you hearing about a Biden administration and how it might approach North Korea?
I would think that President Trump has taken unprecedented steps, and I think that given Kim's control of the nuclear weapons program, that a summit had the potential to, a leader-to-leader relationship had the potential to lead to somewhere. But what we've seen so far is that we're back to the status quo pre-summits. But I think that a Biden administration would probably be much more centered around the alliances, given what the former vice president has been saying about alliances, about rebuilding them, and to ensure that we confront the security challenges together instead of on separate tracks. And I think that has to be, and bringing these stakeholders together would be one of the key goals. I would argue that that instead of this extreme bilateralism, that I would argue for more multilateralizing of the issue. That it would be useful from my perspective to have 5-party, 6-party conversations about the issue. So one of the things that from my view, one of the reasons that North Korea doesn't enter into agreements anymore is that a new president can just get rid of them as soon as he or she comes into power. But if we can have a sustainable multilateral conversation or mechanism that we can provide we could agree on pressure, but also agree on incentives that the group as a whole can follow through, regardless of the democratic processes in South Korea, Japan, and in the United States. So to have some sort of sustainable model for dealing with North Korea, to try to integrate North Korea into the international community, and to have that peace and security that would be beneficial to not just the U.S. and South Korea, but also to North Korea and to Beijing and to Moscow.
Well, I said 2 more questions, but now I'm going to say 2 more questions because the conversation's so interesting, Jung. Let me ask you, would you accept a partial deal from the North Koreans that's some variant of the Hanoi proposal, where North Korea shuttered part of the Yongbyon facility. Perhaps you got International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back in. They maintain the moratorium, they commit to the moratorium, but then in return, the United States offers some kind of sanctions relief. It doesn't have to be full. I mean, President Trump at Hanoi tried to entice Kim Jong Un with a partial sanctions relief deal, which Kim Jong Un rejected. Would you take a deal like that?
I think some sort of sanctions relief has to be a part of how you continue to incentivize North Korea. But Steph, as you know, on verification, we always get stuck on verification, and North Korea's refusal to allow inspectors in to really ensure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that that there are ways to have that right outline, that have the right roadmap, but we couldn't even get there with 2 years of summits, and that's really disconcerting to me, that after having these very high-level meetings, the amount of attention and the resources that were given to try to get North Korea, to get Kim Jong Un to make credible moves, that we haven't been able to move that forward. So I think when we talk about partial deals or about lifting some sanctions, I think part of that has to be have a strong verification mechanism, strong, reliable, credible verification mechanism. If we can get there with Kim Jong Un, I would say let's do it. I haven't seen signs or signposts or indicators that I would have looked for if I were still at the CIA to suggest that Kim was serious. We haven't seen in terms of allowing verification, or even talking about verification, or even sending technicians that would be able to credibly talk to our technicians to talk about the steps that we could take to improve bilateral relations, and also to start to dismantle North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that the North Korean team clearly didn't have the level of detailed expertise at Hanoi to have that kind of discussion at Hanoi. So I'm going to ask one last question, and it's probably the most frequently asked question among our participants, but it was one I was going to ask you as well, and may surprise you, but it has to do with the question of human rights. This is an extraordinarily dictatorial regime. It maintains a large prison camp system. It purges even technocratic actors who appear to make mistakes. It's generated a refugee crisis at various points and spilling over into China, which China itself has had to concern itself about. How do we think about the human rights issue? Is this something that you only get at ultimately through regime change? Is it something that can be negotiated? Or is it something on which the United States ultimately shouldn't be saying anything or can't say anything? In preparing for these remarks, something struck me as quite surprising, which is that both President Trump and President Moon have actually tried to avoid this subject, even for very different reasons. President Moon, because he doesn't want to get in the way of his engagement strategy, and President Trump, because it doesn't seem to be a top priority of the administration. Yeah. What do you think about the human rights question? Should it be on the table?
Yeah, we often think of human rights situations, whether it's in North Korea or elsewhere, as something that's supplementary, as a nice to have. But I think in the North Korea case, it absolutely has to be integrated into our national security policy with respect to North Korea. And I explain that in the book in terms of yes, there is a brutal repressive system in North Korea where families, sometimes 3 generations in, are sent into the prison camps, and there's horrific accounts that have been documented by the UN and by the United Nations and other groups. But I argue in the book and elsewhere that it has to be integrated because for example, without a loosening of the repressive system in North Korea, we can't have a real verification or credible verification. So if the technicians and the scientists and the people who live in North Korea are not able to freely talk about the systems and the capabilities that North Korea has, then we can't have a reliable, verifiable system. Also, I think that would also be a key signpost if North Korea did start to loosen up its repression of its people, that North Korea does, that would, for me, that would be a key sign that Kim was serious about better relations with his neighbors and better ties with the United States. But I think, we talked earlier about how Kim is really cornered or hampered by in thinking outside the box when it comes to nuclear weapons and not being able to have a very calibrated, nuanced conversations or negotiations with the U.S. I think it's also true with the human rights situation in North Korea. He can't. I think at this point he needs to repress human rights in North Korea to justify his rule. He needs that to shore up his legitimacy. He needs it to ensure that there are not alternative centers of power in North Korea. So I think that it's a mistake that we have not had a human rights envoy to North Korea in 3 years. That if a new president comes in the United States, that's one of the first things that we have to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We can get Ambassador King back on the job. And I have to say, Jung, you ended with on a wonderful note of understatement when you said that Kim Jong Un is challenged in this regard, and I think we can all agree on that. First, I just want to compliment the World Affairs Council membership. They're a terrific set of questions. We did our best to try to cover and weave them into the conversation. Jung, it was a real pleasure. I hope to look forward to doing this again at UCSD. And I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Nora for closing words. Thanks very much, Jung.
Thanks, Steph, for your wonderful moderation.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Haggard. As they are turning it over to me, I also wanted to thank Dr. Pak. We're immensely grateful for the opportunity to have you as our speaker, hoping that we can have the pleasure of seeing you in person once we're able to have in-person events, hopefully in the near future. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure others did as well. Dr. Haggard, I apologize that we were having connection problems and we were not able to do a formal introduction on your background also, as you are indeed a very knowledgeable person, professor of Korea Pacific Studies, director of Korea Pacific Program School of Global Policy and Strategy at U.S. UCSD. And I hope that when you decide...
I think someone was just not muted. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you, sorry. Our alliances with other councils nationwide has provided us truly an opportunity of being able to provide informative seminars during these difficult times. And they are educational and somewhat entertaining as we learn new things. I also want to thank all of our audience. We had about 450 people registered, and also our staff and interns who have been assisting us during this time.
Like 450 people can join this. It's not the same as seeing somebody in person.
But 450 people joining is a lot more than.
I think we're having many mics on, so if I could kindly ask for individuals to stay muted until we say goodbye to our guest, as she needs to, Dr. Pak actually needs to leave by 2:30 for another engagement. So thank you, everyone, and we wish you well and see you at our next event coming up on September 10th. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for hers.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nora, I think I'm showing a dialog box here, which is the poll, which seems to still be in progress. It looks like if I click it, the poll will end. So if anyone is still on and would like to answer this poll, I need to get off here shortly. And so maybe I'll just give 30 seconds and then I'll close it.
Right, that would be great. Thank you. I think Mia can monitor that from the central backend, but
Mia, do you have it?
Yes, I'm good.
Okay. See you all. Thanks for having me.
thank you, Doctor.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.